thank you to David for inviting me to be part of this panel. Well, thank you. And the thought for me was because there was a panel about repair. Well, that's great because I'm really interested in repair. I'm not a scholar of global higher education, so let's see how we go. So I've engaged with David's question, which was sent to us originally, or his comment, which was, our aim is to reflect on the ways in which universities can repair and mitigate geopolitical tensions and can mobilize their own soft power capacities. But indirectly, I'm trying also to touch on some of the issues and the questions that Lee subsequently sent to us. So I've organized this around 3 reparative challenges to higher education, and it could be broadly understood as policy challenges, and 3 potentially reparative responses. So what can we do by individual universities and HE systems? So these are some reparative challenges. They're obviously not the only ones. They're plenty. So the first point I want to make, and it might seem an obvious one, and I have to say I speak from a position of, I'm a huge fan of higher education and universities. But I think there's a tendency for us to forget that universities are social institutions, and the people who work in them and the people who study in them are part of society. And we bring with us patterns from the societies in which we live. We may well be critical of them, we may well speak back, but I think I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that somehow higher education is this autonomous space, and all these terrible things happening in the world currently, the uncertainties, the unevenness, the massive global wealth inequalities, the racism and so on, are somehow, we're not part of that. But we are part of it in different sorts of ways. So I think that is a reparative challenge, even as universities continue to be spaces of social critique and the production of academic knowledge and so on. And of course, these kinds of geopolitical and social pressures also shape people who come into our universities as students and people who might stay on and work with them. So I was interested very recently to read a statistic from MasterCard Foundation, who did a survey on people's philanthropic giving. And they found that 65% of those aged 13 to 28 are prioritizing travel, food, arts, and live music. In other words, they're not particularly interested in philanthropic giving. So given that sort of age profile, these are the young people coming into universities, and these are the young people who become academics. And then in Britain, the Charities Aid Foundation has found a massive decline in the percentage of 16 to 24-year-olds who are willing to give to charity. So it's down from 55% in 2017 to 36% a few years later. And then the final statistics I just want to put out there, because I think this affects all our lives. I'm not sure why we tolerate it. And if you've not read Ingrid Rebaine's book on libertarianism, you should. It's a very persuasive argument against these huge global wealth inequalities. But to take one statistic, in 2020, the world's 2,153 billionaires, largely in the industrial north, had more wealth than 4.6 billion of the world's population put together. This is the world in which we live, and this is the world within which our higher education institutions are based. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is around soft power. And I think the question here for me is soft power for what? And to whose benefit in a very globally uneven and stratified higher education space, which raises the question, can higher education globally be a reparative space? Does it have the capacity to do that? It's still shaped by a neoliberal orthodoxy, which prioritizes economic growth over flourishing, over dealing with the climate crisis, and universities themselves are not immune from behaving very badly towards each other. So in the face of the sort of capping of undergraduate numbers in the UK, you found the elite universities leading the way to sort of scramble for the undergraduate numbers, grab as many students as they could, and leaving the rest to do as well as they could. So it's not as if it's a system we work in harmony. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of self-interested behavior that goes on. So if we want universities to be producers or spaces of soft power, we've got to be upfront about the unevenness and the inequalities and the fact that universities don't necessarily behave very well towards each other. My third reparative challenge is the effects and the impact of centuries of colonial disrepair, ecological, social, economic, and psychic. And this has not gone away. It continues and it lives in what people call the afterlives of colonialism. And of course, it's generated a very unequal higher education system across the globe. So recently, Penny Enslin and Nikki Hedge have written about this, the persistent impact of colonialism specifically on British universities, and I think they make a very persuasive argument. And then others like Kulwant Gopal have written about racism in British universities, and of course Riyad Shah Jahan and his colleagues have written about coloniality, white supremacy, and so on. So there's a lot of stuff out there. But I just want to take one example of a recent study led by Saba Haleta, where they took OECD data in the aftermath of the SDGs, and they focused specifically on the money awarded for international scholarships. And what they found is that after 2016, there's been quite a rapid decline in the amount of aid money that's gone directly to higher education in developing countries, and an increase in the amount of aid that has gone to scholarships, which of course are taken up in the global north, not in countries of the global south. So to take one of the years that they looked at, they found this sort of massive, they found that scholarship aid amounted to 79.6%, so virtually 80% of the total aid to higher education, with the remaining 20% going to the recipient countries and their higher education systems. And of course, scholarship aid is actually a benefit to the global north. The money is spent in the global north, and it supports the salaries of people in the global north. So these for me are three quite significant reparative challenges amongst many. So having said that, what can we do about it? Can we do anything to move towards policies which are fairer, which support ecological flourishing, reparative justice, and so on? And how can we go about it? And I've got three suggestions. The one is that we work with creative and imaginative conceptual frameworks. And I think there's a whole cluster of ideas around repair, reparative futures, reparative justice, reparative pedagogies, reparative capabilities, and so on. And I think we need to look more carefully at writers from the global south. So, for example, I personally love the work of Achille Mbembe, who's a Cameroonian philosopher who works in Johannesburg. And recently he's called for the need for planetary consciousness and planetary habitability. And his argument is we need to learn to care for the planet, humans and non-humans. We need to repair the planet, and we need to, above all, we need to learn to share the planet. So I think it's quite an interesting and generative framework. And there are others like Olufemi Otawa and so on. And they link this back into the idea of repair. And then, of course, I would say that I still really like Amartya Sen's work and his notion of capabilities formation, and the idea that one way in which you judge how just a society is you look at what opportunities are available to everybody to be able to flourish and to make choices about the kinds of lives they want to lead. But there are many others as well. But the point is, I think these conceptual frameworks and these ideas and so on can help us to imagine and to think about a different higher education. The second one, I think, is to ask hard questions about how social policies and higher education policies can become factors of transformation. So how can they work in the direction of transformation rather than reproduction and neoliberalism? And transformative policies in a kind of Fenian terms would sort of enhance citizens' freedoms to live and to choose a life that they value at the individual level and at the collective level, to work together to contribute to more sort of capability-friendly economies and societies. And a recent paper by Jean-Michel Bonbon is quite interesting because he talks about transformative policies operating along three intersecting levels, and he says you shouldn't conceive of the beneficiaries, whether it's academics or students or higher education or institutions, only as receivers. So we are receivers in terms of we are provided with resources in order to do things. And we are doers. We are provided with the real opportunities in order to be agents. But he said the really critical dimension for transformative social policies is that we should also be given the opportunity to become judges. So able to evaluate the situation in which we find ourselves, to develop aspirations free of adaptive preferences, and to have voices that count in the policy-making process. I think that's probably the most reparatively difficult under current circumstances. The third thing I want to suggest is that what I find the very generative and interesting work by Julia Paulson, who's conceptualized this idea of reparative pedagogies across a range of international projects that she worked in her EdJam project. And what I really like about this is she reminds us, that's not a new idea, but she reminds us that we don't have to wait for perfect policies or system change or all reparations to be done and dusted and so on, that we can look for the spaces of possibility now. We can look for the niches in which we can begin to work differently, do things differently, and bring about change. And she has 5 core principles for reparative pedagogies, and she's careful to say these are not the only ones. And in fact, in our work, we find that we sort of don't think they are the only ones. But hers are dignity, truth-telling, a multiplicity of narratives, responsibility, that is acknowledging historical advantage, and creativity. And we would add solidarity and connectedness, and we think a broader normative directionality for reparative pedagogies of eco-social flourishing. So those are 3 ways, I think: transformative policies, reparative pedagogies, and the kind of conceptual frameworks that we work with, which I think offer us hope and possibility of change against the challenges of, what universities are, where they're located, the kind of world that we're living in at the moment, and all its uncertainties, the challenges of disrepair, and the questions around soft power. Thank you.
Melanie.
Hey, Shibao. Thank you very much, Lee, and I really appreciate being part of the panel. I want to congratulate, because this is the last day, so I want to congratulate CGHE for running a really successful conference.
Thank you.
For my remarks, I guess we will probably organize under 4 main points. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the changing of geopolitics, and then because I'm situated in Canada, so I'll bring in some Canadian examples to help me illustrate some of the point. And then I'll talk a little bit about the influence, the impact on higher education, and then I'll move on to a specific issue I want to reflect on, that is particularly the recent attack on EDI or DEI, and then move on to talk about some pairing kind of suggestions. For those of you who particularly attended, I think the session organized by Lee, I think on yesterday morning. So I think certainly laid down the groundwork in terms of the geopolitics, etc. So I won't go there, but I just want to say in terms of some of the very kind of prominent kind of changes in Canada. So certainly, I think in terms of the globalized world, I think it is much more fragmented and much more polarized, and also we see I think the world be reconfigured, and also I think the landscape of geopolitics is also being redrawn, and we see a lot of reorganization, particularly if you look at Canada, because Canada, really the U.S. caught Canada by surprise, being targeted, being the very first in terms of the trade tariffs, as well as that rhetoric could become the first 51st state. when the new Prime Minister Mark Carney took on the role as the new Prime Minister, the very first task he did was revisit France and the UK, and also claiming that so particularly the relationship with the US as the closest ally and closest trade partner is over. So he's seeking basically, I think, partnership with Europe, et cetera. You can see how things, I think, has been reorganized, reconfigured, and that landscape has been redrawn. So I think that's a broader kind of landscape. And move on to higher education. You can see how that has influenced the impact of higher education in particularly. I think we see more computation than before, and particularly the whole kind of national security has become a gatekeeper because if you look at Canada, so last year when Canada was very close to the US, basically followed the US in terms of coming up with almost a blacklist for universities, as a threat to national security for Canada. So there are over 100, I can't remember, 20 universities on the list. So among them, 83 are Chinese universities. So they are drawn particularly because they may potentially pose risks because they do research, which might be used for military purposes and et cetera, et cetera. So that's the argument. Along with these lines, for people, particularly who do research in social sciences, and if they do apply for a national research grant, so they have to sign an agreement called confidentiality agreement. So they have to declare that they do research in China, so you wouldn't engage in any kind of confidentiality issues as well. So that's one. And secondly, for any of the international visiting scholars and students who visit Canada, so they have to go through a security check. So you can see, particularly, I think, the changing geopolitics and the impact on higher education. So you can see more competition, less collaboration. In terms of the mobility, you can see, I think, less mobility, but as well as national security as primarily a big paper. And particularly that impact on academic freedom is certainly very, very prominent, very kind of concerning. So that's one. And there's also more, of course, and we heard particularly kind of racial profiling for people, have done research. And, before 2018, so it is the thing to do to collaborate with Chinese universities, co-publish, right, and engage in internationalization, et cetera, et cetera. Since Trump launched the China initiatives in 2018, all of a sudden, so collaborations, international co-publications could be suspected espionage, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people were kind of arrested, on the, basically allegedly being espionage, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see, I think, the whole kind of landscape of geopolitics certainly had impacted on higher education in particularly. So I'm doing this time.
You're great.
Okay,
Yeah,
right.
good.
So the other thing which is really close to my heart is that the whole issue of EDI or DEI, because different countries use different terms. So it also kind of related to the whole kind of change of geopolitics. And also, I think it's also closely kind of connected to the theme, the conference, et cetera, et cetera. So because I myself have attended several kind of panels or 2 panels related to international student mobility, which is important. So we know as a result of transnational migration as well as the international student mobility or population, particularly for many OECD countries, including Canada, is becoming ethno-culturally diverse. So say, for example, Canada, the foreign-born population is 23.2%. So almost 1 in every 4, right? 1/4. So which is foreign-born. So really significant. So which means universities have the ethical and moral kind of obligation to create inclusive and also equitable kind of education environment. So which also directly goes into, I think, particularly the 2030 UN agenda in terms of ensuring kind of equitable and inclusive education for all. But at the same time, I guess starting from January, primarily on January 21st, and basically Trump signed a new executive order to eliminate DEI programs or programs, policies, and fundings, particularly, I think, for federal government and a lot of universities, and particularly federally funded schools, etc., etc. And so basically saying that if you don't do that, you will lose your funding. We have beginning to see some of the impact in terms of some of that. So you can see universities have been directed to dismantle EDI programs or risk, losing type of funding, affecting a lot of areas such as admissions, financial aid, and also hiring practices as well. So the impact is really far-reaching. And also, in terms of institutional responses, in response to these orders, universities are reassessing a lot of their EDI initiatives. Some have eliminated EDI offices. We know, I guess, in many parts of the world, I know in Canada, so there are EDI offices. We have a vice provost, equivalent to an associate vice president in that role of EDI as well. So in the context of the US, basically, so they all closed down. And you see, basically dismantled the whole kind of EDI initiatives, but not only within US, but also require any kind of US embassies in some of their supplies and fund, if they receive grants from, say, US government. So they have to follow the new EDI policy as well. So I think we have a lot of questions asked in terms of who is affected by this, who benefits, and also what's the role of universities in terms of as the changing agent and in repairing and mitigating these global tensions. So that leads to I think some of my kind of suggestions in terms of by bullet point in terms of what we could do. So that's what I think that's important. So I think we need to claim EDI as our legal, ethical, and moral responsibility to embrace diversity in all aspects of our universities. And because, so I thought we have gone through this debate, whether diversity is a deficit or is an asset, right? So this is like a going deja vu, but certainly I think it's important. So we need to affirm that diversity is an asset, so not a deficit. So I think we need to challenge particularly the colorblind and the different deficit perspective, and also number 3, enhancing diversity and fostering and particularly inclusion, and will contribute to a stronger and more cohesive society and education as well. So I think the promotion of EDI in higher education contributes to the nation building, particularly social cohesion, economic prosperity, and alignment with the core values of of democracy. So I think we need to adhere to this, but at the same time, so because of what's going on, I think I'm wondering whether we need to go beyond the current kind of a more EDI initiative, because a lot of them that we hear the critiques, so it's more kind of tokenism, a lot of discrepancies between policies and practices, particularly with a lack of practice. And so I think I'll stop there. So
That's great. Thank you. Hey, on to you. Yes.
Well, first, thank you for everyone in the center for a fantastic conference. I think we have learned a lot. And in terms of my response, I initially engaged with David first. The question, he sent us an article about soft power in American universities. And I received it while I was attending a conference in the US. And it's an annual conference, it's the American Applied Linguistics Conference, and I attended often. And this year there was an atmosphere of fear in that conference, which I have not witnessed before. So I started thinking about the article and the loss of soft power in American institutions while being in the US amongst American academics. So on a long flight from Denver to London, I started researching American universities. And I discovered that the American institutions of privilege, the Ivy League institutions, have been complicit in the crimes of their time for so long. They did not speak about Native Americans. They did not speak about slavery. They did not speak about the Red Scare in 1920. And then, of course, the witch hunt in the 60s. And as I was thinking more about the role of American institutions and that atmosphere of fear that we are, or many of our colleagues in the US are experiencing, I realized like 56 years ago, they turned down students protesting on Vietnam in Colombia, and many of them actually came out and spoke about their experiences. Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian activist who was a reporter who is now under persecution, is persecuted under the Immigration Nationality Act of 1952. This act has been used to deny entry to the US to Pablo Neruda, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and the British author Doris Lessing. It was also used to deport a poet and essayist Margaret Randall and other civil rights activists. So this is not new to the American, like many, of course, ICE did not exist in 1968, but an equivalent to it does exist in the American systems. So I started thinking, coming from a language research point of view, on the critical discourse that's being used to describe the situation in the US. And I started thinking about the silence that I have witnessed in the last conference or the conference I was attending, and the fear that many academics are experiencing. And not that I'm ever going to defend Donald Trump in my life. This has been the case before. And one thing when I was reading the article that David published in Financial Times, came to mind was the Senate hearing with the 4 university presidents who happened to be women in December 2023 about anti-Semitism in US campuses. Many, of course, who are also writing a paper about it that you will read about soon. One of my co-authors is here in this room about it. So as we are working on this paper, and I was reading that article, the Senate hearing happened during Biden's time, December 2023. A lot of the Congress people are graduates from Ivy League university, and the line of questioning was full of disdain, full of disrespect to the role of higher education. Their questions were filled with logical fallacies. Like the opening question to the 4 university presidents was, do you hire faculty who support Donald Trump? A lot of logical fallacies like this. One of the most striking things, the whole hearing is striking, but one of the most striking question in this hearing was about what you are doing to combat anti-Semitism in your campuses. And whenever any president answered most of them gave the same answer, which is more education, more research. That was met with a great deal of disdain. They were like, what? No, give me something specific. The president of Colombia was under a lot of fire. She gave, of course, a very poor defense. However, when she said more research, more education, they asked her again, what are you doing? Do you have any actions to discipline the students? She was like, we come from a different time. Our disciplinary actions are about students cheating and not students protesting. So we have to think and create these policies. And that, for me, as a language researcher and coming from a critical discourse point of view, I started noticing and reflecting back on the article that we were sent to read on how there are so many parallels between what's happening in the global north in the US and our experiences in the global south. Many women in the south feel that they cannot be heard, similar to those university presidents, that their language is not encrypted properly, and they are met either by being silenced or they remain silent when they do not know how to answer. So I started thinking about how the problems that we are witnessing in today's American academia, and hopefully not the British academia, are related to how, and now I'm going to use the VOC and hopefully not be so boring as I'm doing that, a lot of it is related to modernity and how that, now coming from as a language teacher, modernity requires, or the modernity discourse requires a universe where knowledge perspectives are compatible with the cognitive needs of capitalism. And if you think again of those university presidents and the responses that they were giving, such as, we want to do more research to help all of our students. The best way to address anti-Semitism is research, and no, J, action. What do you want to do? Because that's not the language they are speaking. So back, I will conclude with Spivak, where she said that for the subaltern to be heard, they need to speak the language of the powerful. And that language is considered, should be rational, and it requires different tools, different epistemological tools than what is being currently offered. And Lee just told me that my time is up. So I will hand it to Simon, who agrees with me on that. Yeah.
Before we proceed, can I just check, is everyone in the back, and how's the volume level for you guys? So. I'm afraid we don't have mics up here. I wish we did, but maybe we can just do our best to project as best we can.
Yeah. No, I will just have a very big, loud voice. Yeah. Well, I'm truly honored to be invited to join this closing panel. Many thanks to CGHE and many thanks to David. Well, the past 2 days, has been an extraordinary intellectual gathering, from which I've got a lot of takeaways, to reflect upon. Well, I would like to readdress the concept of nation in the context of globalization, internationalization, higher education. Nation is nation state is a recurring topic during the past 2 days, from different plenaries. Well, over the past decade and more, I have been teaching and researching higher education in a national flagship university in China. So while I also engage in extensive policy consultation work with the Ministry of Education and the university leadership. So I have keenly felt, too many tensions, between the nation, the university, and the individual scientists.
So I also keep an eye on the global trend of higher education development. So based on my, I used to do a research on 9 countries, including Indonesia, India, Japan, Germany, UK, Malaysia, Australia, etc. And I've noticed that, there is a trend, the transition to a nation states intervention to higher education policies is happening during the past 15 years. So my personal experience, my academic observation suggests that the nation state has never been absent. The state is crucial subject of globalization and global governance. Even when globalization was flourishing to its height a few years ago, the nation has continued to be a significant actor in higher education, internationalization, and globalization. So nowadays, in yesterday's panel, when people talk about bringing the nation back in, it's a very hot topic recently in political sciences and in other social sciences. We are not talking about. We do not mean to restore nation into a central position, but rather repositioning, reconfiguring, and reorganization it to address new problems and challenges. The nation faces challenges in its relationship with the market, the society, as well as those posed by globalization, global governance, and the national governance. However, the approaches, the extent, and the domains in which the nation exerts its influence vary across different countries and cultures, and largely depending on the nation's capability. This includes the nation's value orientations, its self-perception of its own role, and its understanding of other actors, and the limits of the nation's power, as well as the limits of the nation's interests. Furthermore, higher education itself is a very, very different, very unique social sector. There are numerous values intertwined within the domain. For example, equity versus excellence, equity versus efficiency, political logic versus economic or scientific logic. So all these, values can also be further divided into short-term and long-term considerations. Education is never an endeavor that yields immediate results. Its impact often becomes evident only after decades or even more. So all the mentioned makes higher education really complex, highly diversified, is highly value loaded, and requires more national capability. Therefore, we need more detailed case studies at the regional, institutional, and individual levels to reveal the roles that different nations play in the global governance of higher education and in national governance as well. For example, I am currently conducting a study with my doctoral students sitting in front of me on the role of China's central government in the internationalization of higher education. Primarily, mainly focused on the international collaboration of scientific research. The preliminary findings suggest that from the year 1980 to 2020, the state has been gradually retreating in scientific international cooperation. In the very early stages, the state acted as a provider and supervisor by establishing specialized institutions such as National Science Foundation and China, for example, China Scholarship Council, to fundraise and to launch programs to encourage, to facilitate scientists to collaborate. However, as the market became more involved as a key player and through the use of evaluation mechanism, the government's role has diminished significantly over the past 5 years. Our research finds that the nation's capability in collect resources in the international arena is relatively weak compared with the nation's capability in the domestic affairs. So universities began to take more responsibility in international collaboration. For instance, since 2019, just before the pandemic, Chinese universities began to initiate a few large-scale international scientific projects, established cross-national industry university collaborations, formed various university alliances, and create key labs across institutions and regions. So in all these activities, universities became the main actors, while the state has taken on the role of a facilitator. So that's a very big change, particularly for the past 5 to 6 years. So what does this imply? It suggests that universities need to exercise greater agency to balance national demands with global scientific development needs. Well, of course, we have also observed significant differences in the role of national and different universities within a single country, which may even exceed the difference between different countries. For example, Tsinghua University, the university I'm working at, receives less than 1/3 of its funding from the state, less than 1/3. Well, if you ask Tsinghua's president or everybody in Tsinghua, do you consider yourself a national flagship university or global university? The answer would definitely be the prior one. So it's a national flagship university, but the funding from the state is less than 1/3. And over 2/3 funding coming from transnational and domestic enterprises, as well as alumni donations. In contrast, many local universities, even local high-level local research universities, they receive more than 70 or even higher than 80% of funding from the government. So even within the country, universities at different hierarchy, in different hierarchy positions, their situations are very different, and the nation's capabilities are also very different in influencing this. So I will stop here and I will leave the rest of the time to Simon.
Wasn't that interesting? And doesn't that start to change, the common perception of universities in China? I think that everyone outside China has about the universities in China, and it's a very important system. Lee, thanks very much for convening us. And it's really great to share this with this panel. And David, congratulations. It's really brilliant conference. And I don't think there's ever been such a vibrant atmosphere at a CGHE conference. And we can say that CGHE is not only alive, but very well. So well done. And there's so many themes, aren't there, in the concentration of the 2 days? So many themes and so many issues to reflect on, so much said, so many good papers and conversations, and so many bad things happening as well that we're all talking about, we need to talk about. I think thinking globally is being able to see the world as a whole and imagine the world as a single subject, even as a single political subject, an interest in its own right, if you like. And the global ecological imaginary takes us to that. And that's the starting point, I think, of thinking about knowledge and higher education too, but it's not the only thing, of course, that matters. And it also, I suppose, thinking globally is about thinking about the global common good and trying to work on what that might be and share that conversation, because there are many ways of thinking about that and many takes on it. And that's the point, isn't it? Global common good is that diversity, and is that diversity coming together and the handling of similarity and difference within that framework. But let me go to Wayne's question. I mean, why are nation states being more assertive in this period in some respects? And already Wayne showed us that it's not the same everywhere. The pattern is different country by country. And I think especially between the old West and non-West divide, between the colonial world and the colonized world, which now is achieving unprecedented agency historically. So we are seeing things playing out differently across that divide. So the big divide still matters. But multipolarity is cutting across it at the same time. And that dynamic between those two major structural changes, the colonial and decolonial divide and the and multipolarity, and the way those intersect are where many of the tensions are playing out. Why are nation states becoming more assertive? Well, obviously we can point in the West to nativism, the response to migration policy issues, the way in which single identity and the suspicion and fear about the cross-border and multi-identity, or the way those things are playing out in politics. We can perhaps more generally say, historically say, there's anxiety in Western populations and governments about multipolarity, about the rise of China, but also everyone else as well, and about the overturning or the beginning of the overturning of the old colonial supremacy. And that, of course, as Riyadh has so brilliantly shown us, has such a strong racial dimension as well. So it's about the white world's anxiety about the non-white rising. Those things are playing out. But I think there's also something else. There's something which has been pointed to in some of the commentaries about UK policy. The failure of neoliberal reform to deliver what these neoliberal governments wanted from it. And the way in which prestige competition took over when they deregulated these markets and created student consumers and so on, the way in which institutions expanded in size rather than becoming more efficient or attuning themselves more closely to the economy. And that setting in train a certain disillusionment with neoliberal regulation, the idea of the market as deciding things rather than government deciding. Well, government's back, government's deciding things. So does that mean we're in a post-neoliberal period, which some people hope we are? I'm afraid not. I think it means the end of a particular kind of neoliberalism, sort of deregulationist neoliberalism based on these semi-automatic corporate driven markets. But not the end of neoliberal ideas, not the end of neoliberal goals or neoliberal mechanisms and systems. They are very much still in place. What neoliberal reform did after 1990 or thereabouts, and starting with the Anglophone world, spreading everywhere, was it put in place new control systems which were much stronger, more effective than the previous relationship between the state and the institutions. This sort of engineering capacity the state gained through neoliberal reform and new public management. The pivot was the corporate executive in the institution. The corporate executive was the child of the state, could be controlled and directed through performance indicators, funding levers, and so on, cutting off funding or increasing funding, both seemed quite effective in getting executives to behave. And of course, all the research assessments and other forms of stratification that could be held over the institutions. And at the same time, the corporate executive was the instrument for internal control, gain control over the academic units through the budget model and through performance indicators, through the systems of promotion and appointment and so on. And considerable control over academic labour, sort of a corporate kind, more like a conventional business or organisation or corporatised public sector and so on. So all those systems were set up, as we all know. We complained about them an awful lot, but actually they weren't activated so as to abolish academic freedom and institutional autonomy. That was the interesting thing. There was a kind of compromise so that they weren't fully actualised in terms of their potential to directly determine the internal culture of the institutions. You went from a sort of collegial style autonomy, institutional autonomy, to a more corporate style, which was about control over money and the legal responsibilities and so on. But there was still a lot of autonomy there for institutions. In some respects, of course, managers gained autonomy. They gained power, which is what made it so attractive to many executives. At the same time, many of the forms of academic freedom were preserved as well. It varied by institution, with the most elite institutions usually preserving academic freedom better than others. But to a degree, faculty were still have still been driving their own teaching and research agendas. Increasingly, slowly, more and more hemmed in by the performance environment that they exist in. But governments are increasingly impatient with the results of all of that, as I said. So, in recent years, we've seen the employability agenda gaining a lot of clout, a lot of, I suppose, a new virulence, a new capacity to start to change the pattern of teaching and research so that the humanities, the performing arts, are now in the gun in a way they weren't as much before, and so on. So all of that's been going on. But of course, there's interventionist governments and there's interventionist governments. And the populist conservative intervention is a lot more dangerous, a lot more direct, a lot more immediate. The Trump-style populism is a far greater problem than the employability agenda. And the employability agenda is a problem. It's a considerable problem for the knowledge-centred teaching and research work of institutions. But the Trump-style agenda directly truncates in international relations. It wants to remake the curriculum around notions of singular identity, and of course, very reactionary in terms of gender. And you can see already how quickly this is rolling out. And the terrifying thing is the way the university executives fallen into line. But of course, this is what's been set up by the neoliberal governance system. What's now happening is this almost automatic supplication to the state in the US, but that's been coming for quite some time. And you not only saw that in the 3 months since Trump was elected, we saw that in the China initiative, and then there wasn't nearly enough concern raised about the way in which institutions gave up all their autonomy in relation to the China initiative. So the presidents all stopped going to China, and they invited Chinese university presidents to come to the US. I was in Beijing in 2024 in July, in June at PKU, and I was told by the head of the international office that the president of PKU had just been refused a visa to enter the US. I mean, no one said anything about it at the time, but that kind of thing is now the norm. So the China initiative, which has cut visas for incoming scholars to about a fifth of the level it was, and has already truncated international student mobility in particularly doctoral education, as Wenjin showed us earlier today. I mean, all of that's been happening for a while, but now, of course, it's happening on a much larger and more worrying scale, and it's going to get worse. I mean, what's happened at Columbia was a tremendous step downwards, but I think that is only the beginning of similar kinds of patterns which will play out in many institutions. So if we know about the problem, where do we go from here? Well, I think that it's become harder because we are nested in the state. We are nested in the state not only through neoliberalism, we've always been nested in the state, as people have been pointing out throughout today. And so we can't, I suppose, institutionally decouple from the state altogether. We can probably, as individuals, go quite a long way away from what our governments want us to do, but there's a limit to that too. But still, we can defend institutional autonomy and especially academic freedom and international cooperation as well as we can. And we need to be agentic. We need to be out there. We need to be obvious and public about those issues. We need to test how far our universities can move away from the state. I mean, I think that it's not all bad. I mean, China's universities are going in the opposite direction. I mean, they're moving towards greater trust, greater freedom. That's a different historical pattern to the Western pattern. And the problem's really in the West at the moment, and that's where we've got to work, I think, in sustaining and protecting freedoms and institutional autonomy. But we can also look to a world in which the US, for all sorts of bad reasons, rather abruptly, is not going to be the global leader it was in higher education. But that, of course, in some ways reflects also the multipolarity, the way in which many systems are now much more agentic, the potential for multiple cultures to have an influence on higher education and its development, the way in which we might even be able to break through on non-English language knowledge. It might be possible now with more agents in the mix, and with the English language monopoly being less firmly held down from the US. So I think that it is going to, while it would be crass to say it's opening up new opportunities for everyone else, there is a kind of a gentle vacancy being created by the implosion of the US system and that will hurry the process of others coming into the mix. And that's a really good thing. I mean, it's not just about East Asia, which is certainly, a big part of it. And it's not just about India, and which is a rising star in terms of higher ed and knowledge. It's about the global South more generally, and Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, are going to be becoming part of the global conversation in this strange, tempestuous, fragmented global time in a way they weren't before. I suppose the last thing we can do is keep on working together, have solidarity with each other, look after each other well, because we are, some of us, going to come under direct personal threat at this time, and look for others who are also in that situation, and, show them every support, bring their cases forward, do what we can in relation to Gaza and the West Bank, especially, because that's the epicenter of the world problem right now. But also remember Africa, remember what's happening in Sudan, remember what's happening to Ukraine. I just think we've got to work on those issues ceaselessly now. And in doing so, we will fulfill our mandate and our obligation and our responsibility to the global common good.
Wow. Thank you, Simon, for that, and thank you to the entire panel for all of your various interventions that you've offered here today. I mean, this is really fascinating, I think. And so you've pointed in very different directions for how we would go about achieving repair, I think. And so, starting with Melanie, with various pedagogies and imaginative frameworks that we scholars need to think through. Shibao also offering us, speaking to DEI, particularly in our obligations in institutions to build diversity, to create inclusive environments. Anoud pointing importantly to the complicity of higher education over the long term in various histories of social injustice, and how we need to reckon with that. When as well, so you also point to how universities need to exercise greater agency in achieving this balance between the national and global imperatives here. And also Simon, of course, pointing to in all different directions about how we need to defend institutional autonomy, academic freedom, defend partnerships. Gosh, that's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot of responsibility there. And so, if I may, and I know I asked a question about what policy repair means to you, and I think you've answered that quite definitively. So, if I may just tweak my question before we can open it up, I would like to ask you then, whose responsibility is it for repair? Like who should shoulder the most burden when it comes to repairing the situation we're in? And it feels like, do we as academics carry all of that? Taking into account what Melanie said about how we are also parts of the societies that produce us. And so we are kind of refracted through them and complicated by that in some way. So I guess, I don't know, can I just throw it out there to you? And then also maybe invite everyone else to chip into that question.
Well, I think that, the role of the state is really not only crucial for our sector, but in general. The state is the pivotal point at which the collective interest is developed and expressed in any society, even a highly individualist one like one we're in now. The state is really the crucial instrument and actor, and a lot of this is about changing what states think and do in this period, isn't it? And they're going in the wrong direction. So I guess students, and I'd say students first, because actually they're probably more important. And faculty have a special, I suppose, capacity to raise questions about the role and responsibility and nature of the state. And in a way, they're only one step away, or they may be within the ambit of the state themselves. They're part of the state in a larger sense in any society. In some societies, pretty close to it. So I think that, you can't just talk about what we should do. We talk about what the state should do and what we should do in relation to the state. I think then becomes, pretty central. But in some societies more than others, there's an important role for us as public actors and in bringing issues forward to the population as a whole using media as well as we can. Of course, we can always do that well, and we can always do that better. You know, that's part of our responsibility too. But of course, I mean, academics are not the estate that's going to carry global transformation on their own. Academics in the larger sense of students as well as faculty. But, you know, they are important, I think. And we have a lot of agency. We have a lot of agency, not so much money, but a lot of agency.
Please.
One of the takeaways from our panel, for those who attended, was that one of the speakers, Professor Maher Hashba from the USAID in Palestine, said that one of the best ways to continue working on decoloniality is to have transnational collaboration. And I have been hearing that repeatedly, people referring to what he said. So simple steps like those could help us. Yeah.
Please, Melanie, and then Shibao.
I think it's a complicated question because I think within our own countries, there is a responsibility for those of us who work in universities to look at what the possibilities of change are within our own nation, within our own country. There can be at this juncture. I mean, South Africa is interesting because the government has a much stronger stand on Palestine, which is quite unequivocal, than academics do. So if you're sort of taking your cue from government, then all the academics should be robust in their support for Palestine. But in fact, it's very, very uneven across the sector. So I think that's kind of quite an interesting example. But I think within our own sort of national context and the histories of those particular nations, we have a responsibility to do something in the place where we find ourselves and that we know best. Beyond that, I think the notion of responsibility is unevenly distributed. So, of course, I do think that the responsibility of the North, and particularly elite universities in the North, is different from the responsibility that one might expect of people in the global South. I personally would like to see much more reflexivity about the self-interest that drives global North universities and elite global North universities, and dare I say, the people who work in them. I think there is a responsibility to think about historical advantage and the ways in which you benefited from it and what you're actually going to do about it. I don't hear voices raised about aid going to scholarships in the global North rather than to the global South. I don't hear voices from academics about, what happens to aid, to the cutbacks in aid, to the 70% of loss of funding for health research in South Africa because USAID has decided on to cut everything. So I would like to see more, I would like to see less self-interested behavior on the part of elite global North universities with regard to the global South, and a little bit more about people putting their money where their mouths are.
Yeah, Shibao, please.
I want to go back to the last point I think Simon made in terms of the call for working together. So I think that collective action is very important, and particularly I think given that such a fragmented, polarized, I think world, I think we do need to work together as change agents. So this goes to, I think, the whole purpose of higher education, whether it's really there to prepare people for the global market, or is it for people to prepare people for the as agent of social change? So I think as academics, I believe we have a responsibility, and particularly I think there is a form of academic activism. Right, so we're not only doing research for the sake of doing research, but I think we do have that ethical and social responsibility in terms of making a social change. Say, for example, currently I'm looking at social movement learning. So there are different forms of social movement. So I look at anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Indigenous movement. Racism, etc. So there have been in North America, anyways, different waves of movements. So for us, I think we have a responsibility to reflect back and so theorize some of the social movement learning. So that's a contribution to education, but at the same time, I think I see it as a form of academic activism. So I think right now, going back to Canada again, so it's a grassroots movement. So that is the elbows up movement. So it's very much a kind of a grassroots movement against the current U.S. I guess particular rhetoric again, trade war as well as the annexation. So I hope we can follow the elbows up movement, and I think really kind of activate our kind of agency.
Yeah, great. Thank you. When did
I
you
just want to
Yeah,
very
please.
quickly add one point. Well, I'm thinking that, well, there are many domains that universities could exercise this agency. Traditionally, we talk about, talents, student training, social service, and the scientific research. But I'm thinking that, there are some other subtle domains we might ignore. For example, discursive power, the discursive field of university, and also the this word appears many times, epistemic power, because we are creating knowledge and also we are transferring knowledge and disseminating what kind of knowledge we are producing. That's also very important. Yes, that's a small point I want to add. Well, for the responsibility, I always think it's not, only one party's responsibility. In governance, we have the word shared governance. So in terms of responsibility, we have the shared responsibility. So yeah, so each party, the government, the public, and also the company, the market, everybody, they have all the stakeholders, they have their responsibility. But for university, what we can do, actually very limited things we can.
Okay, thank you for that and for indulging me. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think we should open up to the floor. Love to hear your thoughts. We have a question online as well, so let's go first to the floor. Yes, please.
Very much, the panel, for your contributions. I think my question is actually on the limit of responsibility as a term. How much accountable can we become, and who are we accountable to? And I'm drawing from Judy Butler's giving account of oneself, and what are the limits of being responsible or accountable and doing? And I'm connecting this to the Council for European Commission's paper on responsible internationalization, which has been a very recent debate on how do we do internationalization that is responsible, and then which is directly related to trying to see how we can stem or mitigate the threats posed by internationalization to security and all that. And we've seen a lot of countries also have taken up positions, the UK, the US, China, even Taiwan, as we've seen this morning. So that's the premise I'm sort of deeply this limits of responsibility. And I want to connect that to who has benefited. Okay, so then the question is, what have we been doing? Have we been doing irresponsible internationalization, and what does that look like? And who has benefited from that or still benefited? And what does the future look like for irresponsible, now in quote, internationalization? Thank you.
Shall we take another question at the same time? Would that be okay if we give you some time to think about that? Maybe we can get another question in there. If you want to link it to the question of responsible internationalization. Or another matter. Yeah, please, go ahead.
To shift the back the political control, strengthening the academic autonomy. I wonder if when the conditions is not mature for the political economic, like the USA for the international development, support for global challenges and development in the global south, and the autonomous agencies function better, and through what kind of and support this institutional cultural transformation to be sustainable, inclusive, diverse, and healthy. Thank you very much.
So the question is then, how can autonomous agencies function better? Is that, yeah. Okay. All right. We'll take one more and then we'll please.
I'm quite surprised by Professor Lennon's research that you find that China's like the nation role in China that is kind of shrinking down and compared to 3 years before. But from the observation that in the Western countries, many of the Western countries, kind of the nation or the countries kind of stepping out. And what do you think about this different kind of the roles that comparing like between the Chinese role, Chinese nations responsibility and the Western? And what do you think are the reasons behind it? Apart from the economic influences factors, what do you think as the higher education researchers, how could the university grab its agency kind of in dealing with the geopolitical tension? Yeah.
Okay. Great. Let's open up to the panel. And in any order, please. And
responsible internationalization, really question. I think where it went wrong in the West was this day-night definition of internationalization being a quality of the Western unit, the Western person, the Western institution. It becoming more intercultural, more global, and so on, without thinking about relationality, without thinking about the effects on others. And internationalization has to be understood as a relationship, and you have to look at all parties to the relationship and what it means to them. And there was, of course, a great ambiguity about a lot of Western internationalization, you know, with lots of negative effects which are not acknowledged or seen as part of the equation in the West. As the West is becoming more and more international, this is great for the West, but on the other hand, maybe it's not so great for everyone else. And the great example is the commercial international education system in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc., which we have not talked about much in these 2 days, and yet it's probably the biggest single negative about the British situation in relation to global higher education is the crassly commercial character, the charging of education master's students up to £40,000 for a 1-year course. I mean, you know, it's just so horrible, and of course so socially exclusive. So, you know, I think we have to think about the relational effects. So I think relationality, accountability is to the other parties in the relationship. That's the first point, of course. But of course, there's the historical point. I mean, that Melanie made so well about the you know, the colonial heritage, the fact that the world has been organised on the basis of the distinction between the colonial power and the colonised, and that is still the most important historical legacy that we're still getting to grips with, and that should be front and centre for anyone working in the Western countries that have exercised colonial power.
As I heard that question, I was thinking of listening, similar to what Simon was saying. A lot of the work that we do between the South and the North, now it's time for our colleagues in the global North to listen carefully to us and what are doing. I'm coming again from my language teacher point of view. So a starting point for more responsibility is to listen to what we need and what we know and what we don't know, not operating based on the assumptions on what we don't know or what we should learn.
Still 2 more questions about to answer.
How can
Well, I guess
function better? Yeah.
I guess with this responsible internationalization. So, well, I guess when I got here, so I'll give a webinar, I guess, on the internationalization of higher education in China. So looking at particularly that global social imaginary, I think, in terms of particularly that Westerners wrote, I think, you know, we're talking about this responsible or ethical internalization is very important to de-Westernize the approach as well as the decolonization approach, as well as, you know, as a very important aspect, a dimension of internalization is international student mobility. So, you know, Simon mentioned, you know, charging £40,000 for a year, you know, that well, it's expensive, a lot of money. But on the other hand, so we're not looking for in Canada anyway. So we're not looking after what international students growing up. Europe will offer orientation, one-time orientation. So and then you're left to either swim or sink. So I think if you're talking about responsible internationalization, so besides charging the money, so we need to provide an adequate support, particularly for international students.
Yeah, please.
I just want to say something very quickly on internationalization, which I'm not an expert on, and I don't work in a system which is particularly internationalized. But I do want to raise the issue of brain drain, which I know it's not a new issue, but it does go with international scholarships that young, the best and the brightest get these scholarships. They go to the global university. Who do their very best to hang on to them and have various schemes and so on, and they don't go home. So there are two sides to this. So I remember Ravi Kanbo, who's an economist at Cornell, saying a few years ago in Tokyo that, well, you can't stop people from moving and from making decisions about moving. So there's not really much that you can do about it. And I understand that point. Another argument was one brought up by Gillian Brock, who's a South African-born philosopher who works in New Zealand, who looks at these issues of global justice. And part of her argument is when wealthy countries recruit from, say, young people who go on to do PhDs in global north, for example, they keep them, they have jobs and so on. They must then materially reward the countries from which those young people have come. The countries which have been responsible for their primary education, their secondary education, who supported them. Or in our case, I think we produce very, very strong PhD students. We see them go to Oxford and various other places. And the argument would be that South Africa should be then compensated for the cost of getting the person to that point. So I think that's also an interesting argument. I think there are lots of different things to actually think about in this debate about responsible internationalization.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I have a quick answer to your question about responsible internationalization. Well, I think that's for education, for educators, that's quite normal, quite easy. That's the nature of education. Just to foster more humanity to our children, to foster more empathy to our children and to foster, cultivate them with more culturally inclusive. So that's the nature of education, including international education. I just heard that Trump's government, is thinking about replace human teachers with AI teachers.
That's great.
Yeah, so if human teachers will be replaced by AI, how can we teach our children with humanity, with empathy, with all this culturally, inclusivity? So
Maybe Trump's.
that's responsible education.
Wow. Okay. Well, we only touched on that first of the three questions. Any comments on the other two, or do you want to fold it into the next round?
I want to pick up Euron's question. I mean, I think that, if it had happened 20 years ago, the USA cutoff would have been worse because, the number of countries that produce more than 5,000 science papers a year has doubled in that time. So there's, in the sort of what you might call the stronger half of the global south in material terms, there's now indigenous science capacity. And that means that those systems can grow to play some of the role which the aid programs were playing, which have fostered a layer of infrastructural capacity and personal capacity. So there is now prospect of building a substitution in many countries, but not all. And I think maybe what that suggests is the potential for global south countries and countries outside the West in the global south to aid the development of capacity in research and science and higher education in more and more parts of the global south, rather than that being seen as a kind of gift from the West in the way that it was in the past. Maybe the whole pattern of aid is going to start to shift But, you know, the British cut back aid as well, really heavily, not just the US. I think the question about China's role is Fiona's question. I might leave to Wayne.
Yeah.
Well, when we're thinking,
Yeah, okay, yeah, please.
when we're thinking, so I can respond to Yujan's question. I think it's a good question in terms of agency building. So in my work on social movement learning, so we look at alliance building. So I think that alliance building could be one way of enhancing, I guess, agency, and particularly so we see different models of alliance building, such as university and community, and with different marginalized communities, etc., etc. So, and certainly we have some good findings in terms of how that enhance the kind of agency.
Okay.
Well, Xiaona asked a very good question. How should a university take strategy to enhance its agency? Well, I think a very practical strategy for university. I mentioned a bit in the final in the final part of my talk. Well, money is not everything, but money does matter to university, for everybody in university. So, yeah. So if you could, the reason why my university get only very small part of funding from the government, but large percent of this money from outside the world, from the society, because you know the university is making meaningful contribution to the society. So that means your research, you are producing useful research to the industry, to the society. You are making meaningful contribution. So in that way, your agency will be exercised. Otherwise, if you rely on funding from the government, you know, how can you exercise your agency? That's my quick answer.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a liability. Okay, all right. Well, thank you. I think due to time, I know there are probably more questions in the audience, but what we can do is, will you be joining us on the tour? You can pose your questions to them on the tour. Wonderful. So with that, then, given the time, I'd draw to a close here. I want to thank you all for really leaving us with a lot to think about and take with us. So,
On behalf of everybody's here, I think we should extend a vote of thanks to David.
Yeah.
What's been amazing.
Well, all I'd say is thank you very much. It's been lovely to have you all. I've now got a year's supply of webinars. But we'll put everything that was been recorded, that you were happy to be recorded, on our website, so you can go and catch all the panels you didn't catch, which of course were many. I'm sorry, it was all parallel, and the slides. So if anyone's got slides, please send them in to us so we can put them all up. As ever, volunteers, webinars, you know, we're all keen to get the ideas. So please do get in touch. Suffice to say, it's safe journey home. Come back next year. Enjoy the tour, and there's lots of tea outside. Thank you to our panel. Thank you.